Dungeon. At the moment when the energy of deception and failure accumulates to the limit, the underground labyrinth begins to form regardless of the location. He feeds himself with the energy of the dead and creates a sweet bait to lure more food. There is always an abundance of monsters around her. After all, there is an artifact in the heart of the dungeon. The older and more dangerous the dungeon, the stronger and more expensive its artifact. That's probably why in recent years, instead of taking care of the population, many kingdoms focus on controlling dungeons and searching for artifacts. Dungeons capture the hearts of people. A clear sunny day. In the wilderness, commands are issued for soldiers and warnings about threats to the local flora. One of the soldiers looks apprehensively at a pink flower. A dark-haired man tells the soldiers without orders not to take an extra step as they approach the dungeon. The dark-haired male researcher Stitch Atheler turns around when he is hailed by members of his squad. The blonde squad leader asks if this is the place. In front of him is the entrance to one of the oldest dungeons in this kingdom. The blonde gives orders to unpack the luggage and prepare to enter the dungeon. He says that the journey took a whole week and that they have no extra time. Stitch thinks, looking at the commander, that he is cool and even could afford the services of an A-class researcher. After all, the discovered dungeon is just as dangerous as the A-rank dungeon. There could be anything inside it. Stitch looks at the squad and realizes that with such power there is a chance of success. The commander calls Stitch that it's time to move out. Stitch uses the Pathfinder ability, which allows you to find the shortest path to your destination. This is the quality of an A-class researcher. He also uses the ability Animal Instinct, which increases the sensitivity of the fingers and toes, giving the ability of echolocation. These are abilities beyond human senses, ultrasonic detection and vibration detection. The researcher's abilities are what Stitch does for a living, since others do not have a similar gift. The soldiers behind Stitch doubt that he can be trusted to follow him, but convince themselves that Mr. Harold hired the researcher for a reason. Stitch orders the whole squad to stop, saying that he will go ahead first. They need to look carefully at their feet and beware of the ceiling. Sharp stones hang over the heads of the squad. Every time Stitch takes a step, he hears the creaking of the spring behind his back, but most likely the traps in the dungeon have been rusted since the day of formation. But Stitch asks the squad to stick to the wall when he moves. The soldiers are amazed by the researcher's abilities. Stitch walks, holding onto the wall and listening. Along the way, he diffuses traps. They come to a spacious room. Further on, the path will be more difficult, since in the largest part of the dungeon there is a dungeon defender who guards the artifact. They are in the heart of the dungeon. For Stitch as a researcher, this is the last stage, since he is not a magician and not a warrior. One of the soldiers orders the shield bearers to move to the beginning of the formation in the order of the advanced defensive formation. Warriors with shields line up in ranks. To awaken the defender of a hangover, you only need to give him a sign. Stitch throws a stone. Wind flows out of the arch at the other end of the cave. The soldiers are holding their positions. A hairy paw protrudes from the arch. The monster's face is shown, similar to a wolf's with burning eyes. This is Tarusk. The monster lets out a loud roar. The dark-haired commander urges the soldiers not to panic, and the first squad to launch an attack. Tarusk spews fire from his mouth. Soldiers, holding shields, take the blow. The commander calls for activating the shield wall, an ability that allows you to resist physical and magical attacks. Crossbowmen are ordered to aim at Tarusk's mouth. They tell the commander that the fire is too strong, and because of poor visibility it is difficult to shoot. The commander understands that Tarusk is too strong and it is possible to attack only by relying on feelings. He asks Stitch if he can use his abilities to target Tarusk's mouth. Stitch replies that he has never used anything like this before, but he decides to try to help the squad and picks up a crossbow. Stitch uses the animal instinct and shoots the monster. A crossbow bolt hits Tarusk right in the mouth and wounds him. The monster rushes at Stitch with a roar. He manages to dodge. One of the soldiers flies away after the Tarusk attack. The released crossbow bolts bounce off the monster's armor. Tarusk throws himself at the soldiers again, using physical force. The commander orders, using shields, to knock Tarusk off his feet so that he could not get up. The monster swings his paw at Stitch lying in front of him. The soldiers use a shield blow against Tarusk, causing him to fly away. The commander behind the monster is preparing to strike. He wounds Tarusk in the left eye with a sword. The soldiers use the shield strike again. Tarusk flies away and falls to the floor of the cave. The blonde warrior attacks the lying monster. He hits Tarusk right in the head, and then raises a bloody sword above him. Tarusk is dead. They have won. Stitch is amazed that he will finally see the artifact with his own eyes. They pass into the room where the treasures lie. The blonde asks Stitch why he is a class A researcher, but he has not been able to clear any dungeon. He says that this is most likely the first artifact Stitch sees in his life. In front of them, surrounded by green light, is a ring with a skull. All team members are amazed by the find. Stitch confirms that this is the first artifact he has seen. The blonde takes the ring and offers Stitch to touch it. The researcher asks if they are not afraid that he will escape with the artifact, to which he receives the answer that in this case he will pay with his life. Stitch remembers the agreement that everything in the dungeon besides the artifact will go to him, and still decides to touch the ring. He holds out his hand, while the blonde greedily watches his actions. Stitch only has time to be surprised by the flash of green light from the ring. Then he screams, surrounded by flashes of green energy. The soldiers are terrified, only the blonde remains calm. The clothes come off the Stitch along with the skin. He screams, losing pieces of flesh. The blonde asks for forgiveness, looking at Stitch writhing in pain. He says that artifacts are sources of all kinds of negative energy and are not given into people's hands just like that. Stitch is trying to say something. He has practically no skin. He smokes. His fist, clenching the ring, unclenches. Stitch is dying. The dark-haired Balstock commander leans towards him and informs him that the curse has been lifted. The blonde gives the order to leave. Balstock takes a ring from which green threads stretch. The skull on the ring begins to emit green energy. Stitch's hand begins to grow skin. Balstock shouts and calls the blonde herald, who is shocked by what is happening. Stitch screams and the skin begins to rise on him. Balstock orders a retreat. He tries to hit Stitch with his sword, but the sword went through. Crossbowmen shoot at Stitch. Arbalete bolts do not cause any harm to the researcher. The herald is amazed that the Stitch can turn out to be a Xeno-archetype. Stitch looks like a ghost, surrounded by green flames, hovering over the squad. The ceiling in the dungeon begins to collapse. Stones begin to fall from the ceiling. The dungeon is being destroyed. Balstock decides to use the scroll. Gerald looks at Stitch, thinking that he has ruined everything. He rushes angrily with a sword at Stitch, surrounded by flames, but is stopped by Balstock, shouting that he should run. The green flame around Stitch goes out. The Memento Mortem artifact recognizes Stitch Atheler as its partner. After a while, Stitch gets out of the water to the shore. His hand is clutching the artifact. He spits out the water, turns over on his back and looks up. There's a dark cave all around. His body feels like it's being torn apart. He sees that the ring is on his finger. He brings his hand with the ring to his face, remembering the deception of the herald, how he lost his skin and that he had to die. A skull appears in the air, surrounded by green flames, which informs that Stitch Atheler has died. The skull informs the shocked Stitch that he is his inept partner. The herald, covered in bruises, asks if they are the only ones who survived. He and Balstock are sitting on the grass in the forest. The herald shouts that it's all gone. Balstock tries to calm him down. Gerald asks why Balstock used that scroll. Gerald is depressed by the fact that his brothers already know for sure that he has led the soldiers. He should not have allowed the loss. He begins to remember how Stitch's corpse came back to life. Not a single normal artifact, even a parasitic type, cannot move when like a ring if its owner is dead. Balstock has not seen such a thing before and assumes that it is an independent artifact. Gerald says it's a symbiotic type artifact. He tells Balstock that artifacts are divided into two types. The most common artifact is an independent one. They obey the will of the owner, which makes them easy to use as a tool. The other type is parasitic. It may be stronger than an independent, but when the host dies, the artifact self-destructs. These are well-known types, but there is also an exceptional type, symbiotic. Such artifacts can revive dead hosts by themselves. Balstock suggests that they saw such a resurrection with their own eyes. He says that no matter how strong that artifact was, Stitch could hardly survive in the middle of a collapsing dungeon. Gerald says it would be great if Stitch is dead. It's time for them to return to the capital. He orders Balstock to put up wanted posters for Stitch Atheler in all the cities he meets on the way. But in order not to attract too much attention, promise a small reward for Stitch. Stitch studies the ring and tries to use the animal instinct, but the artifact reports that it refuses. Stitch beats with green energy. He groans in pain and asks what the artifact wants from him. The skull appears again. He says that he did not let Stitch die using the passive ability Salvation of the Soul. He tweaked something else and lowered all the characteristics of the Stitch. He lost some of his energy because of Stitch. He is trying to figure out what the artifact is and why he hears his voice in his head. The artifact reports that its name is Memento Mortem. Stitch walks through the cave. A green skull hovers next to him, surrounded by energy. They discuss that Memento Mortem is the only such artifact. Stitch is trying to find out from Memento Mortem what other abilities he has besides communication. Stitch climbs up the wall and thinks that usually everyone has one unique ability attached to each artifact, which can be changed for a good price. Memento Mortem informs that if it functions normally, then you can get at least 40 for it. Stitch breaks down and falls to the ground. He is amazed, since a person cannot have more than 10 abilities in his entire life. Even with the boost, the limit does not exceed 20. Stitch wonders if he can use any ability now. He replies that yes, but he spent all the mana on the resurrection of Stitch, and offers to talk while her recovery is underway. Stitch climbs up and wonders what mana is. Memento Mortem reminds that Stitch has only 12 hours left before his death. Stitch is in shock. He shouts that the artifact has resurrected him, why he has to die again. Memento Mortem says that until he dies, Stitch will live, and vice versa, as long as Stitch's heart beats. He will not disappear anywhere, but if the mana runs out, then they're both screwed. Memento Mortem says that Stitch did not come back to life for thanks, and that if he wants to live, he must be able to spin. Stitch runs through the forest and shouts about how Memento Mortem could warn him right away that they will both die if mana runs out. The artifact responds that it is not interested in life. He was sleeping peacefully until Stitch woke him up. But if Stitch has a hard time surviving, then he will share his strength with him. Stitch's hand is surrounded by green flames. Memento Mortem says that the fact that Stitch awakened him does not make him the master of the artifact. The green skull bites Stitch's fist. A Stitch clings to life, not an artifact. In order for Memento Mortem to recover mana, he needs to use the Curse Devouring ability, with which he can absorb the source of curses and demons against weak monsters or cursed tools. Stitch realizes that he just needs to catch a couple of monsters. At this time, Memento Mortem counts down aloud how much time the Stitch has left. He tries to use the animal instinct to find monsters, but remembers about his lowered characteristics. He decides to look for monsters on the tracks. He follows the tracks and the smell of the monster, and comes across a clearing where the great wolf eats his prey. Memento Mortem informs that the decrease in the characteristics of the Stitch will last for another 1 minute 30 seconds. It is superimposed when there is no mana, as it is an overload. And the stronger the ability, the longer the downgrade. Stitch decides to wait for his stats to recover. He watches the wolf, and wonders how many attacking abilities the artifact has. Memento Mortem replies that one. Air Bullet is a shot of a charge from compressed air at high speed. This is the basic ability that combat mages use. Stitch can only fire one bullet. He understands that his only chance is to aim at the heart or lungs. Stitch pulls out a clenched fist with a ring on his finger and orders not to shoot without his command. Memento Mortem ignores his request. He uses the spell Air Bullet. A large ball of green energy is flying at the great wolf, which pierces through his chest. The power of the spell illuminates the entire clearing with a green light. Stitch is amazed that this is an air bullet. Stitch is amazed by the power of the air bullet spell. He was sure it was just basic magic. Only the smoking remains of the wolf remained. Stitch doesn't understand where such power comes from. Memento Mortem reports that he is not a simple ornament with useless abilities. Stitch looks at the remains of the wolf. Then he brings his hand with the ring to them and uses the spell Devouring Curses. Meanwhile, in the royal army of the Venetians, the action is transferred to a majestic castle. King Botterus has 3 offspring. The first is Raptors, the second is Alfred, the third is Harold. Since Raptors is the eldest prince, then naturally the first pretender to the throne. Therefore, the middle and junior are trying to prove their superiority in all possible ways. Gerald reflects that mining the artifact was a great way to make himself known. But now everyone will look at him as a carefree libertine who tried to take the kingdom's dungeon. His thoughts are interrupted by a bullock. They are riding along a forest road on horseback. Gerald replies that he thinks about that predictor, about Prince Alfred's henchman, Conrad. The herald calls him a scumbag. He trusted the information provided by the so-called alliance too much, despite the fact that the information that there was a curse on the artifact turned out to be true. Balstock assumes that other important information has been withheld from them and encourages Gerald that he is able to overcome all the trials. Harold says he couldn't believe that politics is harder than the battlefield and still hasn't gotten used to it. The sun is setting. A castle can be seen ahead in front of the herald and Balstock, and the herald says thank you to his companion. Stitch stands and looks at the ring, which absorbs energy. He asks if that's enough. Memento Mortem reports that there is no, but it will go for now. Stitch is surprised that mana has only recovered by 15% for killing the Great Wolf. He begins to reflect that they are probably looking for him since he has an artifact. Stitch decides to pick up his things. The action is transferred to a small village. The gate leading to the settlement is guarded by 2 guards. Stitch watches them from behind a tree, wondering how he can get past. He notices the cat grass and comes up with a plan. He needs the grass, lights a fire. Stitch squeezes a burning piece of wood in his teeth and enhances the effect of the herb with Flemon's powder to get a good sleeping pill. Stitch hides behind a tree and clutches a bag with burning grass inside. His nose is plugged so as not to inhale the smoke. The guards see the smoke and decide to look at its source. After a few seconds, they fall to the ground. Memento Mortem notices that Stitch's pot is cooking. He says that he went around a lot of places and became an experienced researcher. He walks through the busy streets of the city. Stitch notices a flyer on the bulletin board with the promise of a reward for his capture as a thief of 400 crowns. Memento Mortem laughs at Stitch, who tears off and crumples the leaflet, scolding his former companions. Stitch, having changed his clothes, walks around the city, carrying a bag of things on his back and reflects on how he became a wanted criminal. He understands that he will not be able to live normally in this village anymore. Stitch looks at the map, thinking that as long as he has rings on his hand, he will somehow live. He is visited by thoughts of leaving the kingdom, but decides not to run with his tail between his legs. Memento Mortem wonders if Stitch wants revenge. Stitch walks across the bridge, throwing the card into the river, and says that only a complete slobber wouldn't want revenge. Memento Mortem finds this very interesting. He offers his help, saying that as long as he helps Stitch, he is invulnerable. Stitch asks what kind of nonsense this is, since so far Memento Mortem can only use 4 abilities. The artifact informs him that he got the ability to get rid of curses and sources of evil for a reason. The powers and abilities of Memento Mortem depend on the amount of mana absorbed. Stitch understands that the more mana Memento Mortem absorbs, the stronger it becomes. And if he absorbs something with a lot of mana, he will become much stronger. Stitch understands that Memento Mortem can absorb other artifacts. The skull tells him that it can transfer its power to Stitch. If Stitch helps Memento Mortem to take possession of the artifacts, then he will gain power, and the researcher will take his revenge. Stitch remembers Gerald calling him a weakling. He asks if Memento Mortem helps, he can really kill Gerald with his own hands. The artifact promises that it will give Stitch a sense of what it's like to smear opponents on the wall. A tavern filled with people who drink and communicate with each other. One of the visitors asks Dalton where you can buy good leather at a normal price. The bartender Dalton, wiping a glass, informs that it is necessary to ask on the black market. The man says that they tried to give him a skin for 500 crowns. He is sitting and drinking beer. His elbow is on a leaflet with a search for Stitch. Dalton says he can recommend a good researcher. He notices the wanted notice and frowns. Dalton learns that Stitch is wanted. The hand clutches a wooden sign with the inscription permit. The one who receives the sign is informed that it cannot be lost, otherwise some of the things may be taken away or searched at the exit. Stitch watches from behind a tree as Streak with bags of things passes through the stone gate, thanking the guard who gave him a sign. Stitch says that in such villages there is always a secret passage, since worthwhile goods enter only through the black market. Memento Mortem asks what Stitch forgot in this village. He thought Stitch would head to the dungeons. The researcher reports that climbing into the dungeons without an escape scroll is suicide. They are discussing the scroll used by Harold and Balstock. There are a lot of them on the black market. Stitch finds a secret passage to the village. This is a small passage in the wall, closed by a wooden square. Stitch knocks on the door. Stitch says goblins eat freshwater base. Because of the wooden door, he is informed that such a password for entry was 3 months ago. Stitch laughs, apologizing to Dalton for not coming in for a long time. He recognizes Stitch. Dalton squeezes Stitch in his arms, glad to meet him, and saying that passwords need to be known. Stitch says he has an urgent matter. Dalton laughs at him, remembering his words that the back door is not for him. He invites Stitch to a tavern, offering a drink. There are a lot of people in the room. Stitch asks for permission to be accommodated, to which he receives permission. Bones and a jar of red liquid are poured out of the bag. Dalton and Stitch discuss the search for the latter. Stitch shouts loudly, drawing attention to the fact that he is selling the claws and skin of the great wolf. While other visitors are looking at his goods, Stitch is interested in how much the scrolls cost, to which Dalton replies that 600 crowns. Stitch asks for a loan, since his things will not sell quickly anyway, and he urgently needs money. Dalton laughs and says no. Stitch is upset, and Dalton wonders how much money he needs. Stitch needs 4 scrolls. He promises to give them all the day after tomorrow. Dalton asks what Stitch stole that he could pay 400 kroner and clear the name. Stitch says that one son of the local king behaved too brazenly, so he wants to teach him a lesson. Dalton says that one of his acquaintances can sell the scroll for less, for 400 crowns. He advertises the Stitch of a gun seller and says he will write down the payment in his name. Stitch asks Dalton to get some provisions and thanks him for his help, approaching the weapons seller. Stitch bangs his fist on the table and wakes up the gun salesman Clyde. A drunk man raises his head with a black eye from the table and asks Stitch what he needs. Clyde is drunk, and Stitch wonders why. He complains that he gives his weapon for half the price, but no one buys it anyway. There are various weapons on the table. Stitch examines the weapon. Clyde assumes that he has no buyers because he is a loser. After that, Stitch decides to make him a lucrative offer, asking which weapon is the best here. Clyde is surprised that Stitch wants to buy something. Stitch offers to buy cheaper, and he will test the weapon. He needs a decent weapon for the dungeon. Clyde says that you need to choose a weapon that will fit into your hand, then it will be of use. He gives Stitch a hammer. He takes it with both hands. Memento Mortem says it's bullshit. The dungeons are mostly narrow passages. How can you swing this thing there? Stitch agrees with him, but starts swearing at him for his sudden appearance. Memento Mortem says that only Stitch knows about it. Dwarf Clyde has no magic power, but his weapon is amazing. Memento Mortem is an artifact and can see the essence of objects, their potential and features. He advises Stitch to take the sword that lies on the far right. If you use this sword correctly, then Stitch will not even look towards the usual weapon. Stitch takes a broad-bladed sword in his right hand, separated by a gold insert. He doesn't think the sword is unusual, but Memento Mortem asks you to believe him. The entrance to the dungeon from which the scream comes. A herd of monsters runs, mouths open. Stitch fights off the monster's attack. The eyes of other creatures look at him from the darkness. Stitch directs a ring at them and asks Memento Mortem to attack. Green energy bursts out of the artifact. He uses the curse devouring spell. Memento Mortem devours monsters, replenishing mana. Stitch takes a pickaxe and decides to get Lapis Lazuli. He breaks through the rock in the cave with a pickaxe. Traps are set at every corner of the cave, which Stitch decides to use for spare parts. Suddenly, he hears a strange sound from a cave nearby. He asks Memento Mortem to shine a light there, after which he is shocked by what he saw. A mineral lizard crawls out of the darkness. The lizard makes the same sound, opening its mouth wide. Stitch is shocked to meet a mineral lizard in the dungeon. The monster makes a strange sound, its mouth wide open. Stitch freezes. The lizard rushes to attack, spewing a pillar of fire from its mouth. Stitch does not have time to dodge, and the fire touches his shoulder. Stitch screams in pain. There's a smoking burn on his shoulder. Memento Mortem tells him to pull himself together. Having the ability to resurrect does not mean that you have to constantly die. Thanks to the artifact's recovery skill, Stitch heals wounds. He begins to analyze the monster he met. The mineral lizard uses poisonous substances and absorbs minerals, so its body is stronger than steel. With the strength of an average level, it's not something to kill him, you can't even scratch him. Stitch directs his fist at the monster, deciding to use the power of the artifact. Memento Mortem warns that an air bullet in such a narrow space will cause a collapse. The mineral lizard charges again, spewing fire. Memento Mortem decides that this is a great chance to test Clyde's weapons. Stitch draws his sword. On the hilt of the sword there is a container with blue gas inside. The mineral lizard comes in to attack. Stitch puts a sword behind his back. The monster attacks. Stitch dodges, shocking the monster. Then, he attacks the mineral lizard from above. Stitch clutches the sword with both hands, aiming at the monster's head. The blade of the sword enters the blue crystals on the head. Stitch presses on the weapon, trying to drive the blade deeper. Memento Mortem says it's time. Stitch presses a button on the hilt of the sword. The weapon punches the monster's head with great force. The mineral lizard is defeated. Stitch uses devouring curses on the monster. Stitch regrets the spent gas capsule. He has only 4 such capsules left. Memento Mortem says that something is wrong. He feels something is wrong while devouring the mineral lizard. Memento Mortem warns that too short a fight can be a trap. Suddenly, the same sounds that the mineral lizard made are heard. Another monster has come out and is going to attack Stitch. He clutches a sword in his hands, preparing to fight. The monster raises its paw to strike. Stitch walks away from the blow and notices that he is in a good position to attack. He rushes into battle, but the mineral lizard reacts in time and fights back, striking with its tail. Stitch flies away and realizes that this monster is stronger than the previous one. Stitch begins to get annoyed by the lizard, but he realizes that in comparison with Tarask, he is just an ordinary lizard. Stitch attacks the monster, but he defends himself with his paw, stopping the sword strike. Then, he hits Stitch with his tail, throwing him away from himself. Memento Mortem warns him that something is wrong with this monster. Stitch says the lizard must have weaknesses. He does not have time to finish, as the monster's paw presses his head to the stone. Memento Mortem screams that he warned Stitch not to relax. Stitch says everything is going according to plan. He clutches Flemon's powder in his left hand and fireflies in his right. Stitch says that the combination of these substances will allow you to attack the monster in weak spots with flashbang ammunition. A flash of bright light. The monster opens its mouth, where the blade of the sword rushes. Stitch says that if you pierce the monster's mouth with a sword, then he won. A warning appears. 95% of abnormal body tissues have been detected. Memento Mortem shouts to Stitch to wait. There is an explosion in the cave. Memento Mortem screams Stitch. The artifact's green energy heals Stitch. The researcher is sitting in the middle of the cave, holding his head and moaning in pain. Not far from Stitch, there is a red-hot funnel in the floor of the cave. Memento Mortem says he warned him to wait. Stitch asks what happened. Memento Mortem replies that the magic of the monster began to control the Stitch. What made the mineral lizard abnormal is inside the dungeon. Stitch does not understand whether he should be afraid that the next monsters will explode. Memento Mortem does not deny this possibility. Stitch is not afraid. He uses his pathfinding ability. The cave in front of the Stitch is illuminated by blue lines. Stitch is looking for more monsters. He discovers a skeleton pierced with blue crystals. Memento Mortem reports that this is the monster. He does not react if you do not approach him, or just lay in one place for a long time. There is another skeleton nearby. Memento Mortem warns that Stitch should not touch them, otherwise they may detonate. Stitch is walking past the skeletons when a strange sound is heard behind him. He turns around. Energy begins to sparkle around the skeleton. The crystals are filled with yellow light. Memento Mortem tells Stitch to run. A monstrous explosion is heard. Stitch flies along with fragments of stones. He tries to cover his head with his hands. Stitch rises from the ground, not understanding why the monster detonated if it wasn't touched. He raises his head and sees ahead of him blue and pink minerals, which are strewn with the cave ahead. Stitch touches one of them, wondering how much he can earn. From his touch, the mineral begins to exude blue energy. It's a spark. Memento Mortem says that he understood what was bothering him. Stitch does not feel this strange magical power that fills the entire dungeon. And the deeper they go, the stronger it is. It annoys even Memento Mortem. The further they go into the dungeon, the monsters they have already met begin to react faster to stimuli and are undermined. Stitch suggests that due to the continuous impact of a strange magical force, monsters began to feel their surroundings better. Memento Mortem says that judging by what happened, it concerns not only monsters. This power affects all objects. Stitch realizes that the passage he discovered is a real minefield. Memento Mortem says there is more bad news. Because of such strong magic, Stitch can't use even a simple recovery skill. Stitch examines his bruised and cut hands and makes sure of it. Memento Mortem suggests that in this non-standard situation, the escape scroll will not work either. If this magic continues to influence the scroll, which should find safe places and help when exiting the dungeon, then on the contrary it can lead them even deeper. Therefore, escape from the dungeon with the help of a scroll is impossible. Memento Mortem says that this does not mean that they are trapped. He doesn't know who released this magic, but killing this creature can help them get out. Stitch realizes that he will have to go further into the dungeon. He goes deep into the cave. Stitch reaches the gate inside the cave and says that he could not find the source of magic. It remains to check only in the part of the dungeon that is behind the gate. Stitch goes there and sees a stone statue with a glowing energy ball. Memento Mortem says it's Jin. Stitch is surprised at what the spirit is doing here. Memento Mortem asks Stitch to take a closer look at the core of the ball. It's an artifact. Stitch is amazed. The spirit is born when power and magic merge. It's just a collection of self-conscious elements that seek to destroy everything in their path. In some ways it resembles a natural disaster. Stitch bounces off a huge rock that has grown on the place where he stood. Memento Mortem says that Jin is the cause of their troubles. The monster's body has merged with the artifact. It sprays magic in all directions. That's why the dungeon turned into a minefield. Stitch realizes that if he destroys Jin, he will be able to get out. The monster attacks Stitch, releasing a lot of stone blocks surrounded by blue energy into him. Stitch dodges them, drawing his sword. He sees how the blocks begin to fill with yellow energy. Stitch understands that they will explode. There is an explosion. Memento Mortem warns Stitch to be careful. This place contains the most of that strange magic, and because of the Stitch, it has become even more powerful. Memento Mortem says it's time to get out of here. Soon everything will explode. Jin lowers his stone hands to the ground. Stitch looks closely at the glowing ball. He doesn't move and looks at the ball. Jin releases energy rays into Stitch. Memento Mortem says that if Stitch wants to survive, then he needs to run. The same one does not move from his place. Jin releases energy rays into Stitch. Memento Mortem tells Stitch to dodge. Jin attacks with a huge and powerful flow of energy. Stitch walks away, covering his head with his hands. When the attack stops, Stitch rushes at Jin. Even a body made entirely of stone probably has weak points in the joints. Therefore, Stitch raises the sword, aiming at the vulnerable places of the genie. He beats the monster with a sword. A stone separates from him, which hits Stitch on the head. He flies away from Jin and falls on his back. Stitch doesn't understand how to do any damage to Jin. Memento Mortem says that you need to aim at the middle where the artifact is located, since this is a creature created by merging with an artifact. And if you absorb magic with the help of devouring curses, then he will be exhausted. Stitch realizes that it is not profitable to use this spell until he gets close to the monster. Stitch holds up a fist with a ring in front of him. Jin releases a powerful stream of energy into him again. Stitch uses the spell Air Bullet. Green and blue energy flow collide between Stitch and Jin. Memento Mortem tells Stitch to dodge. He jumps back and the blue energy flow absorbs the green, and then it splits into several rays that damage the cave. Stitch covers his head with his hands. When the attack stops, Stitch sees that the ceiling above him is full of cracks. He jumps to the side and a block of stone falls from the ceiling to the place where he was standing. Stitch tries another sword attack on Jin, aiming at the artifact. Suddenly, the stones close around him. The sword strikes the stone protecting the artifact. Stitch presses a button on the handle to activate the gas. The sword enters Jin's head with a sharp force. Stitch is trying to catch his breath when Jin's kick throws him to the side. He falls on his back. Stitch is lying down and asks the Memento Mortem why the air bullet did not work. The artifact tells him that it is impossible to use magic skills to the full against Jin due to the influence of his magic. Blocks of stone, surrounded by blue energy, are flying into Stitch again. He defends himself with a sword. Jin attacks with powerful streams of energy. Stitch is alive, but tired. He is sitting leaning on his sword and trying to catch his breath when a stone block flies at him from the left. Memento Mortem warns him about the attack. Stitch says that if he is useless in such a situation, then did he have the right to take revenge? He walks away from the attack and decides to act. If none of his attacks do damage, then we can only hope for Clyde's weapon. If you purposefully hit in one place, then sooner or later a crack will form in the protective layer. He inserts a capsule of blue gas into the sword and rushes to attack when Jin's fist flies at him. Stitch walks away from the blow. Stitch takes the capsule out of the sword. He understands that if he misses, he is finished. Stitch aims at the crack. Suddenly, energy begins to sparkle around Jin. The ball turns blue, energy pulsates around and boulders fly. Stitch realizes that Jin is turning around. Memento Mortem tells him to dodge. Stitch tries to use the animal instinct. Then he is pinned by a stone to the wall. Stitch is injured. He lies on his back and does not move. Memento Mortem asks if Stitch lived.